Welcome into the Odds and Audibles podcast. Matt Prehm, Erik Skopil, Jared Mack on the show today. This Tuesday edition of the show, and it's our first time to really dive into this weekend's matchup. Oregon at Arizona. Game is on the Pac-12 network, 6 p.m. start. Ted Robinson, Yogi Roth will be on the call. Oregon's 4-1, 12th in the country, 2-0 in the Pac-12. Arizona is improved from last season. They're 3-2. They've won a game already in conference play, albeit it was against Colorado. But nonetheless, this is an intriguing matchup and one in which we've learned a little bit about Oregon. And from a health standpoint, not a lot to update here, Erik, but there is a significant player to provide some context on.
Injury report's real simple. It's real quick. Justin Flo didn't play against Stanford. Dan Lanning said on Monday he's trending in the right direction, and that's the injury report. Nobody else missed practice, and honestly, frankly, nobody of import is like even considered, I guess, in that conversation. There's the Byron Cardwell thing, but I just assume at this point that he'll dress and then not play because that's what's happened for about a month now. I don't even want to go into more than that. That's where we're
at. This matchup we were talking about before we started recording. Jared mentioned he was looking it up and noticed it too. This game doesn't happen very often in Tucson. It's been a while, and yet the most recent memory is Oregon getting whopped by 29, 44-15 in 2018. The Ducks were 19th in the country. This was coming off of a big win, or a big loss, up at Washington State. And this was kind of the first, I think, real concern about, I don't know if concern, but discussion about Mario Cristobal's in-game coaching or, overall big thinking. Curious to see how Oregon responds going down there. Different staff, obviously, different environment. Bo Nix talked about it. He was asked about it. Like, no one on his team's played down there, but this is a place that's just kind of given Oregon sometimes some fits, sometimes not.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. You look at kind of the series history here. The last two times Oregon's played down there, they've got, as you put it, whopped. I like that term. Because they didn't play. So 2018, they lost 44-15. They didn't play in 17, 16, or 15, or 14 in Tucson. And prior to that is 2013. And they also got whopped 42-16. The last time they've won in Tucson was 2011. When they won 56-31, but again, over the last 11 years, this is like the fourth time we'll have played down there. So there haven't been a lot of instances. I think Arizona is much improved. I was just doing the top recruits story that I do every week, and I've been doing this for a couple seasons now. And I was looking back at last year's roster, and there are two guys on the roster right now that were in the top 10 a year ago, and those guys were both in the top 3 of last year's team, and now they're both, I think they're like 6 and 10 or 6 and 9. They're down the list. Arizona has really reset the roster from a recruiting perspective. I believe half of the top 10 are true freshmen, including former Oregon commit Teteroa McMillan, who I'm sure we'll talk about later when we talk about the receiving corps for the Wildcats. And they hit the portal really hard. And a bunch of their top players are also portal guys. Their quarterback's a portal guy. Their top defensive player, Hunter Echols, is a portal guy from USC. So it's a different team than the one a year ago that was really, really bad. I don't think this is. I'm not going to sit here and say this is an incredible team because I think it's still like,
right?
Was it 10th, 9th in the team composite in the Pac-12? Jared, what was it? 11th, somewhere in there.
Ooh, I don't remember what Arizona's was. I remember what Colorado's was because that was our sole purpose of the talent composite for the Pac-12. But I think it's like middle of the pack. I can look it up.
I'll give it to you in a second.
I think it's 9th. It's 9th or 10th is my recollection.
They're 9th in the conference, and
this team
there's over a 220-point difference between Oregon and Arizona.
Right. So it would be misleading to say that like these are evenly matched teams, but Arizona is closing a gap on most of the conference because last year's roster was pretty dreadful. There is some 4-star talent on this year's team. Last year's team had like no 4-star players basically. This year I think they have 11, including like 5 guys that are in their most recent recruiting class. So they are reloading to a certain degree. And to the original point, it's been tough to play in Tucson for a lot of teams. And for whatever reason, Oregon's really had a hard time the last 2 times. But I don't know if that has almost any bearing on this team, because it's not like this is a situation where you're like, oh, yeah, remember that 2021 meeting down there, or that 2020, or even that 2019. It's been 4 years. The roster's totally changed for both teams. There's not much you can take from it other than to say Oregon and Tucson haven't always mixed very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's about it. I mean, this is a completely different staff. There's very few people who are even on the staff in 2018 who are still with the program right now.
Yeah, almost nobody.
Almost nobody. But I don't even, maybe Shad Williams, the strength coach, potentially, but that's the only guy that immediately came to my head about this. But overall, just what Erik was saying, this is a very much improved Arizona team. Mind you, their team last year, which I think we would all agree kind of stunk, held with Oregon at home at Autzen. And that was a 1-score game going into the fourth quarter, I want to say, or at least deep into the second half for sure. But again, this is a completely different Oregon team. This is much different than it was last year and how they play. And if you've been listening to the podcast long enough, you'll remember that I was very high on Arizona this season. I had them projected going 6-6, and my projections already stink with a lot of issues. But it's a good team. I think Jaden DeLaura is a good quarterback when he's on during wins, especially. Erik, we talked about this at Starbucks today post practice this morning, but his touchdown interception ratio in wins is 11-1. And losses, I think it's like 5-3 or something like that.
It's the inverse. It's 3-5. It's really bad.
3-5. And so this is a talented quarterback. I mean, we saw Oregon go against him when he played at Washington State, and while he wasn't successful in terms of victories, he still had some moments where you saw the potential there. And Jedd Fisch is an excellent offensive mind, and we'll get to this in a bit. But the strengths of Arizona seem to be on offense seem to be the weaknesses of what Oregon can do on defense. And I just, we'll get to our predictions of the game later in the week. And, spoiler alert, I'm projecting Oregon to win. But I think this is a team that is really underrated in the Pac-12. They just are kind of like a pesky, almost like how Washington State has been the last couple of years, just somebody who's going to score points, and you're going to need to score points with them and pass them in order to win. Still a young team, like Erik mentioned. A lot of their top tier talent is younger guys. They hit the transfer portal hard for Power 5 players, not just guys from the junior college or some lower level school. I think things are on the up and up for Arizona, which is a nice thing to see for the Pac-12 in total. But I think this is going to be a relatively competitive game, especially down in the desert, which Oregon hasn't done well in Tucson or Tempe recently.
Jedd Fisch's improvements for year one, they were 9th in the conference in yards per game offensively at 354. And then this season through 5 games, that number has skyrocketed to 476 yards of total offense. And they're 5th in league play in the conference right now in total offense. Mm-hmm. That speaks to, I think, the coaching that he has, the scheme that they're running. And they, like you guys said, they hit the portal hard. And they've added a lot of guys on the offensive side of the football that have helped. Obviously, you guys brought up Jalen DeLaura at quarterback from Washington State. And probably what's helped just as much is at receiver. They are loaded. Jacob Coing was a guy Oregon really wanted from UTEP. He leads the league in receptions at 40. I think he leads the league in receiving yards at 566. I think he leads the league in touchdown receptions at 7.
He leads them in all. He's the leader in all of them.
Yeah, and then right behind him is Dorian Singer, and he's 2nd in the conference in receptions. He's up there in yards. He's only got 1 touchdown, but their talent at receiver is pretty darn good. So much so we haven't even talked about McMillan yet. Former Oregon commit, receiver, big time playmaker, and I think everyone kind of viewed him as he'd step into campus and maybe instantly become the guy just because of how talented he is, and he plays a lot. He's an important player. He won, I think, Freshman of the Week this past week for the conference, but it's not just him and a bunch of scrubs, and so much so that Dan Lanning's calling this receiving core the best they've faced so far to date in the season, which is pretty high praise.
Yeah, can I read the quote from just Dan about the pass attack in general?
Yeah.
I think this is maybe the most talented team we've played so far at wideout. They have really, really talented wideouts, but I think their quarterback really can play as well. He throws lasers, he throws the ball on rhythm, on a dart, and he doesn't need big windows to be able to attack. They only maybe hurt themselves a couple of times, to be honest. They've done a really good job. They get the ball downfield, they take long shots, so this will be a really good challenge. And I think the point, as we're kind of turning over the topic here that Jared made a moment ago of, I think for both offenses, their strengths face kind of the opposing team's big weakness, because for Oregon, they've been able to throw the football, but you can tell when they're at their best, they're establishing it with the run. And that's what happened this last week when they ran for 350 yards. And this is an Arizona defense that is pretty dreadful against the run. 11th in the conference, gave up 384 yards to Cal a couple of weeks ago. And this is an Oregon defense against the pass, which has struggled. It's kind of funny also because I was just talking before the podcast. Pro Football Focus would disagree because they have the five top graded players on defense all in the defensive backfield. So from an individual perspective, maybe you'd argue, hey, actually you're playing pretty well there. And I do think there have been really nice moments. I still think Christian Gonzalez is one of the best corners in the conference. I think Triquez has played better recently. Like those first, especially Georgia and BYU, and even a little bit against Eastern, there were a couple of moments here, it's kind of like, oh, that's not great. And I can't think of too many really ugly Triquez moments recently. I think that's a really encouraging sign going into this one. Like, part of it might be matchup related. I mean, Arizona's talent at receiver is very different than Stanford's talent at receiver, I think is an important indicator. McMillan is kind of that same kind of big body outside guy, but Cowing is, I think, like 6 feet, 200 pounds, and Singer is like 6'1", 195 pounds. These are more, a little bit more of that kind of quick, agile, smaller body type guys. Singer maybe is a little Dylan Mitchell-y to a certain degree as a comp. But regardless, like these are talented guys that fit the body type and the skill set, at least, of the kind of guys that gave Oregon trouble in Pullman, that gave Oregon trouble, obviously, in Atlanta. So for this secondary, I think this is a really good challenge to kind of see if they've improved, because I thought they played their best game of the season last week against Stanford. The Cardinal really didn't do much of anything throwing the football, I think. Like, he had 160 yards passing, and 78 of that came on like 2 throws, one of which was a screen where there was a big run that a couple tackles maybe were missed. And then there was a tip of the cap throw that McKee made to Higgins for the second touchdown, where it's just like pretty well covered, and he just put it in a really great spot. So I think Oregon secondary has played pretty well recently, but this is going to be a big challenge. And Delores hot right now. Last 2 games, over 400 yards passing, and he had 6 touchdowns and almost 500 yards against Colorado. And I will also say it's hard I think Colorado is really hard to measure much of anything against.
It's a bit different there.
They're bad. They're bad.
Yeah, they're not great. But like Erik just broke down, this is going to be the biggest matchup for Oregon secondary since Washington State, and I guess before that, obviously against Georgia. I think the offense will look a lot more similar to how Washington State performed, with a lot of counters, a lot of quick screens, a lot of just trying to get their guys in open space. That's how Arizona operated last year when they didn't have the personnel to do it. And that's why they struggled a lot in terms of total yards per game, like Matt mentioned earlier. This year they have the personnel, they have the quarterback, they have the wide receivers. Their offensive line isn't great, I would say. I think it's an average offensive line. I think it'll come down to, how much pressure can Oregon apply with just 4 guys rushing? Because, I would anticipate that they'll blitz, because that's just what Tosh Lupo and Dan Lanning will end up doing. But I don't think they'll be blitzing too often. I think they're going to, figure out that they need, to drop 8 or 9 guys into coverage at all times, because there's going to be a lot of routes run for this Arizona team. They don't run the ball as often as one might think. This year, total in yards per game, they only average 136, which is 8th in the conference. It's just not a focal point when they're averaging 340 yards, I think it is, in passing per game, which is 2nd in the conference behind Washington. This is a pass heavy, and like Erik said, Delores has been really good these last 2 weeks and was really good this past week against Colorado, and blah, 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 blah. Colorado stinks. So this will be for Oregon's defense. Obviously, the quarterbacks and the safeties and the middle linebackers who go out into coverage need to do their job. But having DJ Johnson and Brandon Dorlus and Casey Rogers kind of find their groove in these last 2.5 weeks has been a major importance. They had, Dorlus, I think, didn't have any sacks against Washington State, but had 8 or 9 QB hurries and pressures, which is really impressive. DJ Johnson had 2 sacks in that game. Then you flash forward to this past week against Stanford. Dorlus had 2 sacks, and Casey Rogers was in there on a couple of them. So was Jordan Riley. He had a good game. That's going to be monumental. It's going to be very important that Oregon gets 4 guys to be a consistent pass rush and flush Delora out of the pocket, which might lead to some errant throws, might lead to some turnovers, which is what Oregon is going to be hoping for in this game.
Let's take a break here for a second. Then we come back, we'll talk maybe a little about Oregon's strengths in this matchup, and then also talk about quarterbacks just in general, because I posed this question and there wasn't like an immediate yes, but there also wasn't an immediate no either when I posed the question. So a little tease there. When we come back, we'll discuss things with this matchup. All right, welcome back to the Austin Audibles podcast. I asked, is this quarterback 2, quarterback 3 in the conference? I said Caleb Williams was the top quarterback in the league. Jaden Delora and Bo Nix, are they top 2 or 3 guys in the conference? And I don't know if it's a yes, but I also don't know if it's a no. The league is just pretty darn good. And I think we're going to get a really good showing of 2 quarterbacks that could put up some wonky stats Saturday night because of the teams that they're playing, or the defenses that they're facing.
So I was just looking at this. The Pac-12 has 4 quarterbacks that are in the top 25 nationally in quarterback rating, and neither of them are playing in this game this weekend. The league looks good. I mean, Dorian Thompson-Robinson is right in the top 10 there, 12th actually nationally in quarterback rating, not far behind. You've got 3 guys that have had really strong starts to the season, and Michael Penix Jr., who leads the country in passing yards. Cam Rising is right after that, and then Caleb Williams is 25th nationally. Nix is 36th, and Delora is 6th in the conference, and you have to go a ways down because he has thrown 6 interceptions. But, it's a really talented group because we just ran through 6 names, and we haven't talked about Cam Ward, who I think Jared was like, he should be in the conversation, and I think you probably feel that way in large part because of some of the incredible plays we witnessed firsthand in Pullman. I mean, that guy is super gifted in terms of moving around and making plays happen. Shoot, he's 8th in quarterback rating. He's completing almost 70% of his passes this season with 13 touchdowns and averaging almost 300 yards per game. I mean, that speaks to the talent there. And then I know McKee is kind of been dealt a tough hand on that Stanford team just because that's not a very talented offense. He's probably not in my top 6 right now, but that speaks to the talent because I think that's an NFL guy. So there aren't many bad quarterbacks in this conference, period, end of story. And I think that's what makes this kind of a different season potentially for the conference, because I was going back and looking at a year ago and kind of the leaders in quarterback rating last season, and basically a lot of these guys not around anymore. And, it's just a lot of things have turned over. Dorian Thompson-Robinson also led the conference in quarterback rating last year. But Cam Rising, who was the first team all-conference quarterback, was 3rd. Delora was 4th at Washington State. Anthony Brown was actually 5th. McKee was 6th. Then you go down, you've got Jaden Daniels, Chase Garbers, Keaton Slovis, Dylan Morris, Brendan Lewis, Will Plummer. None of those guys are even in the conference anymore.
No.
Dylan Morris he's just behind a couple of guys, I think, up in Seattle. So I think there is a huge improvement this year in the conference at that position. And there's a reason right now that there are, 5 teams lingering in that top 26. I think Washington State's the last team outside the poll last I looked at. So there are basically 5 pseudo top 25 teams in the conference right now, according to the polls. And all those teams have good quarterbacks. And that's a far cry from last year when basically there were not very many teams that were really even considered there. It was kind of like Utah and Oregon, and then a huge gulf. And UCLA had some moments where they were up there early because they upset LSU. And, I think Maybe there was some early USC buzz before that whole season fell apart, but it just feels like this year the conference is a lot healthier at quarterback. And I agree with Matt of like the stats maybe suggest that Nix and Delore are 5th and 6th in quarterback rating. We should note Delore is 2nd in yards and 2nd in touchdowns thrown this year. So he is put up some big numbers, a lot more pass attempts than a lot of he actually leads the conference.
He's also
pass attempts.
Not to cut you off. He's also 5th in the country in passing yards.
Right. Penix is number 1 in the country. So
yeah.
I think, the stats don't suggest from a rating perspective, but I think you can make an argument. These are 2 really, really good quarterbacks. And I think the thing that makes this fun is these are 2 guys that can make a lot of things happen. These are players that can really create off of broken plays and off of scrambles. And Oregon fans have seen Nix do it. And Oregon fans have seen Delora do it, frankly, the last 2 years.
Yep.
When he was at Washington State. Oregon won both those games, but I was looking at his passing stats in those games, averaging about 300 yards, had about 3 touchdowns per game, has performed pretty well in the losses. So this is a guy who poses a lot of problems. He's mobile. He, as Lanning says, he's got a strong arm, throws lasers was his quote. I just think this is a really compelling quarterback matchup, and it's possible we get a real kind of, high scoring offensive game down in the desert and a couple of gunslingers at the helm.
So I think I'll answer the question of if these guys are 2 and 3 in the conference. And no, I don't think so. However, I do think that both of these guys can play to that level any given Saturday. Right. And I just think that like Eric just broke down and went through the whole conference, not the whole conference, but a lot of the conference teams have some good quarterbacks at their helm. I still think Caleb Williams, and honestly, I think Cam Ward is going to get to that point or Cameron Rising as well. They're going to get to that 2 and 3 spot. By the end of the season, I still think Caleb Williams is the most naturally talented quarterback in the Pac-12. But both of these guys can elevate their game with, if they play poor defenses, they'll take advantage. They'll put up stats that you'd see on a paper and think, wow, that could be the best stat line they've seen this week. And then they look at Nix's or they look at Delora's and they see their stat line. This definitely will be a high-scoring game. The over-under is set, at least right now, at 69.5. And I could see this one going over pretty easily because I think both these offenses are extremely high-powered. And, what we were talking about earlier in the sense that both of the offense's strengths are the defense's weaknesses. I think a lot of points are going to be put on the board here this weekend. And I think overall the conference, to go back to the conference quarterback talk that we started, overall, it's just so much better for the Pac-12 that they actually have some competent quarterbacks this year, because that's exactly what they were missing. Last season, there were no real potential high draft picks or something like that. But Cam Ward and Caleb Williams in 2 years could be 2 guys who are considered as first-round talents as long as they continue to develop and they can continue to showcase what they can do this season. Jaden Delore, I don't know about, but Bo Nix is probably a guy who's going to be drafted at one point. It's extremely important for the conference that they're able to showcase that they can still score, they can still play defense, that they can still, produce legitimate talent and have 5 teams in the top 26, like Eric mentioned earlier.
It's actually 6 because there's USC, Utah, Oregon, Washington, UCLA, and then Washington State is just almost.
Oh, you're right.
Forgot about the 6.
Is ranked. And to Eric's point about just the improvement of play at quarterback rating, the league didn't have a single quarterback in the top 25 at QBR rating nationally.
Yeah.
This year they have 4.
Yeah.
To not even have 1 is astronomically bad. But it's improved. It's going up, and there's no truck stops in the Pac-12, as our good friend Bill Walton would say, when you play in the conference. All right, let's end it with this. We talked about the strengths of of Arizona and quarterback play and receiver. There are some glaring holes, though, with this Arizona team, and it's defensively. It would be a massive shock to me if they show up on Saturday and play Oregon stout up front along the defensive line. They might be one of the worst teams against the run that we've seen in a while. And the only reason that they're not the worst It's because Colorado is really stinking bad. I mean, like Colorado might be the worst Power 5 team we've seen in years. But Arizona through 5 games has already given up over 1,000 yards rushing. Oregon on the flip side, 473. Now they played some opponents who didn't try to run the ball a lot. I think that matters here a little bit, but teams can just do whatever they want on the ground against Arizona. And the Wildcat defense is 10th in the conference in yards per play, which is, I think, the best stat to look at, just how they're performing. Over 6 yards per play. This should be a game, much like we saw last week, where Oregon should control the trenches and really do whatever they want through the ground, which could lead them to how they win this football game.
It's kind of funny, actually. I hadn't done this until now, of looking at the splits by a game per game basis for Arizona. There are a couple games that have been decent, and then you've got 2 really bad performances. Like Mississippi State ran for 106 yards against Arizona. That's an SEC team that is pretty decent.
But that's an air raid. That's Mike Leach.
Sure, but they also ran it 24 times, right? So that's about 4 yards per carry. I'm trying to put a little bit of like context behind this, because San Diego State ran it 42 times for 170 yards, about 4 yards per carry. Colorado ran it 31 times for 154 yards, about 5 yards per carry. But here's where it becomes problematic: was North Dakota State, 45 rush attempts, 283 yards. That's an FCS opponent. It's the best FCS opponent. It's like the blue blood. That's the Alabama of FCS schools. And then California in a couple weeks ago. And this is where it gets skewed, and you kind of go, boy, if Oregon can replicate this could get ugly, because Cal ran it 38 times, 354 yards, 4 touchdowns. Jaden Ott had 279, I think, on his own in that game. If Oregon replicates the North Dakota State Stanford numbers, this is where this game maybe doesn't become high scoring in terms of reaching the figures that Jared's talking about, just because you could have a situation where Oregon, moves the ball down the field, runs a lot of clock, and scores that way. But I think it's kind of notable that there are a couple of games they've at least stuck up a little bit. And so I bring that up because I think our assessment here is like, you're going to run for 1,000 yards in this game. I'm still, by the way, Bucky Irving, 100 yards will be a prediction on Friday's show.
That's going
to be it. That'll be made. I will be making it for the 5th straight week, I think. But no, I think Oregon will have success running. I don't think there's any question. It's just a little interesting looking through that and kind of dictating, like, all right, well, maybe any given week they do okay against this team and that team. But I'll also say Oregon's, I think, the best run offense that this Arizona defense has faced all season. And I would be stunned if they don't get in that kind of North Dakota State Cal range of 285, 350. That feels like if Oregon gets there, they're going to be in really good shape to win this game. Although North Dakota State got there and lost, but that's also an FCS team that threw for 124 yards, and Oregon is certainly capable of throwing it a lot more than that.
Yeah, and that's what I think Dan talked about that as well on Monday, just that the team's ability to do both, to run and pass effectively. And we've seen that, multiple times this year. Against Washington State, where Oregon's down, they're able to throw Bo Nix out there and have him throw 44 times to a win. And then this past week against Stanford, it's 350 plus yards on the ground, and then included a Bo Nix 80-yarder. This game is going to be closer to those Cal and North Dakota State numbers, because Oregon's offense is, they have almost like 11. I think it's over 1,100 yards rushing this season. That's basically what Arizona has allowed this entire year. It comes out to like 220 yards a game. It's just pretty abysmal. That should be worse in basically every conference except the Pac-12, where Colorado is averaging or allowing almost 300 yards per game, which is going to be a hell of a game to watch for Oregon too. But I fully expect Oregon to ground and pound this as often as they can. I think it's going to look something similar to the BYU stat line, where they're running the ball 47, 48 times, and Nix is throwing it 16 to 18 times because that's the only reason that they have to.
Unless they get behind like they did in Washington State.
Right, unless they get behind. And if like Eric's saying, if Arizona's defense does come to play that game and they hold Oregon to 4 to 4.5 to 5 yards carry, I'll be stunned.
Yeah,
but
I'm not predicting that, by the way. I'm just saying that was the baseline for teams they were successful against. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. But if that happens, then yeah, obviously Nix is going to have to throw. But I think it'll be against very similar to how they played against BYU. They're going to run the ball, they're going to play action, or they're going to RPO, and they're going to take shots down the field. And that's exactly what they did against Stanford. Those deep throws didn't work. In these stats, these game logs from Arizona's defense, they haven't been great against the pass either. You look at, San Diego State had 16 pass attempts, but that's Braxton Burmeister as a quarterback who we all are familiar with how he can't really throw the football.
Hey, boo! No Braxton slander. Quit it, man. Come on.
Oh, come on! I can't believe. All right, well, I'll save that thought. That's an off-air thought. Colorado is 14 of 30. We all know Colorado is on their third quarterback now, who's a true freshman. North Dakota State didn't have to throw, but they're 10 of 12. California was 18 of 28, and then Mississippi State was 40 of 49. So Arizona's pass defense statistically on the season looks pretty good, but they've had some real stinkers of quarterbacks going out there to throw. Bo Nix is not that. The pass blocking is great. Oregon's talent at wide receiver could be a whole different story than anything they've seen this year. The defense is going to have to play, frankly, like the games of their lives to really upset Oregon. But it is a desert. It is the middle of October or the early beginnings of October. So it'll be, I still think it'll be a close one.
Oregon is the 8th best rushing team, yards per carry in the conference. The closest opponent that San Diego State has played, or I can't talk, my dog's barking. Arizona has played is San Diego State, who's 25th in the country. So that kind of gives you an idea. This is, like Erik said, this will be by far the highest or toughest opponent from an offensive perspective that Arizona has played this season. And so that should bode well for Oregon, seeing what they've done the last couple of weeks against some poor rush defense opponents and what they were able to do there. Nonetheless, it's going to be interesting to see play out. I got nothing else to add unless you guys do.
No, I just think it's going to be really interesting to see just kind of this matchup play out. I'm actually really excited for this game. Unique. I think it's a unique matchup in terms of the strengths and weaknesses and just kind of who can make the most of it. And Oregon protects the ball and forces turnovers, and you get Jaden Delora turning it over. I think it could be. Jared says he thinks it should be close. I think it's close if Delora does a good job of protecting the football. But if he throws 3 picks like he did against Mississippi State or 2 like he did against Cal, I could see it not being very close. And we do have to mention that. Cal thumped him pretty good, and I think Oregon's significantly better than Cal. That was at Cal, to note. But I think there's the makings of a potential blowout here. I also could say that there's also makings of a really, really close game, just depending on how cleanly Arizona plays and, of course, how cleanly Oregon plays. Like, if both teams play an A game, I think Oregon wins pretty handily. If Oregon plays a C game and Arizona plays an A game, it might be upset watch. And if Arizona plays a C game, Oregon plays an A game, it's going to be really ugly, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's kind of hard for, at least now, before I dive into all the rewatches of how Arizona has performed. It's just the glaring weaknesses of Oregon's defense are the glaring strengths of Arizona's offense. And that's what's kind of worrisome, in a game like Washington State where Oregon really physically dominated the entire way and offensively moved the ball like no other game they have this season. They still were down, double digits in the fourth quarter. And so that's kind of a scenario that has played out in my head of how this goes, where Oregon's able to run the ball and move it willy-nilly, but they also can't stop anybody on the defensive side. But like Erik said, there's obviously a bunch of different scenarios. I'm just trying to think of, what is probably a pessimistic viewpoint, but what is something that Oregon will need to work on in order to get into that optimistic viewpoint of that potential blowout, which is still there.
I think the only way it happens is if the offense sputters and we get some Bo Nix turnovers, or maybe red zone inefficiency like we saw at Washington State. And,
or even last week, little red zone issues with the penalties.
And Arizona comes out and they're firing on all cylinders, and they score, which makes Oregon one-dimensional. I think that's probably one of the biggest keys for Oregon this week is don't become one-dimensional in this game unless it's running the football, because you're up. You're up. All right. That's going to do it for us here on the Odds and Audibles podcast. Thank you for listening to the show. We'll be back on Thursday with another edition. We'll have Jason Shear on, our Arizona writer for 24/7 Sports. He'll give us the inside scoop on the Wildcats. And then on Friday, we'll be back, all three of us, for our prediction show here on the Odds and Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.